This episode includes discussions of cracking joints, resetting broken bones by hand, and dislocation and relocation of joints. If any of these are triggers for you, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Throughout history, there have been people who try to take advantage of vulnerable people. From snake oil salesmen and beauticians peddling poisons to quack doctors, it's all been done before, over and over again in different guises. However, there are rare cases in which a fraudulent cure turns out to have a small amount of actual medical value. Today, I'm going to talk about one of these rare cases, bone setting, and the most famous practitioner of the trade, Sarah Mapp, also known as Crazy Sal. Bone setting, or joint manipulation, involves physically moving a bone or joint into or out of place as a form of medical treatment. Bone setting has been practiced in different cultures all over the world for millennia. The earliest known medical text, an ancient Egyptian papyrus from 1552 BC, known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, describes the treatment of bone-related injuries, including fractures, which often required setting. They identified breaks by feeling and listening for crepitus, or the sound and feel of snapping and popping of bones moving against one another. A fracture occurs when a bone is injured and breaks. There are many types of fractures, most of which are quite obvious even to those without medical experience, due to a change in shape at the site of the break and intense pain. Displaced fractures, that is, fractures in which the broken ends of the bone move out of alignment, require being set back into place for any chance of healing. This often requires forceful movement of the bones back into anatomical position by a healer. This is often called reducing a fracture, and at the time it was done by pulling or pushing on the injury until the bones went back into place. Ancient Greek physician Hippocrates was the first to record this sort of manual manipulation techniques in the 1st century BCE. For example, when treating a curvature of the spine, also known as scoliosis, Hippocrates described tying the patient to a ladder, which was then turned upside down. Another technique involved a table with various straps, wheels, and other fastenings to stretch the spine out. Then, using a hand, foot, weight, or a lever, the vertebrae that was sticking out or seemed askew could be forcefully pushed back into place. This was likely as painful as it sounds. For fractures, Hippocrates recommended setting the bone first, then covering it with some sort of fat-based salve and wrapping it tightly after the swelling went down, sort of like a modern cast. He included many illustrations of contraptions that could be used to set bones as well. The design of the treatment table used by Hippocrates and his methods of manipulation survived for more than 1,600 years. 1st century CE physician Avicenna recorded Hippocrates' techniques in his own medical text, the Book of Healing. A Latin translation of this book was published in Europe and greatly influenced Western medicine as it emerged at the end of the Middle Ages. A 1350 Dutch manuscript recorded the treatment of a broken leg, quite similar to Avicenna's method. The practitioner felt for the break and then set it by having 2 people stretch the patient between them while the practitioner worked the bones back into place. After setting the break, it was bandaged tightly and then held straight with wooden splints or long wooden sticks attached tightly with cords. This isn't far from modern techniques dealing with broken legs. except there was no reliable pain medication or ways to treat infection should one occur in the Middle Ages. These bone manipulation techniques again appeared in 16th century medical writings. In 1580, Ambrose Paré, the famous French military surgeon, advised the techniques of Hippocrates for treating scoliosis. After the dissolution of monasteries in the British Isles during the 1530s, monks and nuns with some knowledge of medicine went on to become healers and bonesetters. This continued into the mid-1600s. One of the first books on bone-setting techniques, The Complete Bonesetter, was published in London in 1656 by Friar Thomas. During the 18th and 19th century, industrialization brought many individuals from rural areas into big cities. With them came the rural medical treatments and techniques for caring for the sick. This care was often provided by individuals without professional medical training. Bonesetters fell into this category. The majority of bonesetters were self-taught, passing their skills down from generation to generation, creating families of bonesetters. Bonesetters grew in popularity in the cities as the need rose for the common people, who generally couldn't afford to be seen by a physician for aches, pains, and sprains. Bonesetters were cheaper than licensed physicians. However, noble and even royal families often employed bonesetters, especially when their court physicians failed to aid them. Bonesetting was often a sideline of farriers and blacksmiths, generally the strongest members of the community, as great strength was needed to set bones. Here's how bonesettings typically went. The bonesetter palpated any areas of pain on the patient's body. This meant they felt around for anything out of the ordinary. If the bonesetter found anything that they deemed out, meaning anything that was protruding or exceptionally tender, they set to work, resetting the area. They knew when their work was done from the snapping and popping sound produced by the body when it was adjusted. This included the sound of cracking joints. Here's an example. If there was pain in the spine, the bonesetter would look for one of the buttons of the spine that was out of place. For those who know human anatomy, these buttons are the spinous processes of vertebrae, which can sometimes become dislocated. The bonesetter would then force the protruding button back into place with a quick, strong movement. This worked for some things, but made others worse, which is why the method seems to have worked only about half the time. Bonesetters made no diagnosis and couldn't really identify the cause of the injuries they treated. A good bonesetter kept to what they knew: dislocated joints, displaced fractures, and back cracking. A good bonesetter turned away patients with obvious medical issues like tumors, fevers, and other diseases. Most bonesetters believed in what they were doing, but then as now, there were always some quacks out there just looking to make quick cash from desperate people. With the advancement of modern medicine beginning in the 18th century, bonesetters began to be recognized for their talents, but didn't receive the same status that trained professional physicians did. Some of these self-taught healers were considered legitimate, while others were perceived as quacks. Physicians and surgeons tended to view all bonesetters at best as frauds, and at worst dangers to society. The reason for this is unclear, but is likely the indiscriminate use of bonesetting for every ailment, or the danger involved in manipulating a spine weakened by tuberculosis, a disease that was quite common at the time. Thus, bonesetting remained the domain of the village healers, but village healers were far more visible within society than trained physicians. While trained physicians were all men, many village healers and health workers were women. Though male medical authors of the period objected to the presence and practices of women in medicine, the people of the streets, houses, churches, and hospitals of the city had a very different view. Almost everyone in modern Europe was brought into the world and ushered out of it by women. Women aided other women in birth, treated the sick, comforted the dying, and laid out the deceased for burial. Women, in other words, were central to health and healing. So why weren't female practitioners mentioned more in medical literature? First, women's healthcare work is underdocumented compared to that of many men. Second, medical scholarship strictly holds to boundaries between types of healers, those of the medical profession and caregivers. Third, in medieval and early modern sources, men are identified by occupational labels much more frequently than women are. Men's work was out in the world, while women's work was designated within the home and community, places where labels were less important. In her article on Elizabethan medical practices, Deborah E. Harkness demonstrates that parish and probate records, hospital records, and individual manuscripts highlight how female healthcare workers engaged with the business of health and healing. Women were central figures in the delivery of nursing, medical, pharmaceutical, and surgical services throughout the city. They were hired by public institutions, such as hospitals, as well as by private individuals, as part of organized healthcare systems. Despite not being included in medical journals or being allowed to attend medical school, women were crucial to community health and were also valued as such by their neighbors and patients. In the 1800s, established medical professionals expressed as much disdain for bonesetters and their practices as they did female healers. Many believed bonesetters were the enemy. Sir James Paget, a renowned surgeon, famously said, quote, "Few of you are likely to practice without having a bonesetter for an enemy, and if he can cure a case which you have failed to cure, his fortune may be made, and yours marred." End quote. At the same time, however, medical professionals recognized how popular bonesetters had become to the general public. Medical doctors could do little for everyday aches and pains, and it seemed bonesetters could treat such things. Many physicians sought to acquire the skills of bonesetters. The same Sir James Paget, who referred to bonesetters as enemies, published a lecture in 1867 called On the Cases That Bonesetters Heal, that recognized the benefit of manual manipulation for healing sprains, strains, and setting fractures. He hoped to apply the same scientific rigor to the techniques of bonesetters as other medical practices. He wanted to temper the wrenching and rough movements of bonesetters with anatomical knowledge of what was being adjusted. Few physicians bridged the gap between physicians and bonesetters, but one was Hugh Owen Thomas, one of the foremost surgeons of the day and himself a descendant of a family of bonesetters of excellent reputation. His father had insisted on formal medical training in addition to teaching him the family bone-setting secrets. Thomas had superb clinical judgment in diagnosing and managing orthopedic conditions, combining as he did the best in bone-setting and formal orthopedic surgery techniques. Unlike physicians, there was also an element of awe and mysticism surrounding the peculiar talents of bone-setters. They often worked with patients in front of an audience, astonishing the crowd as they quickly and forcefully moved bones and joints back into place. In Great Britain, one of the most famous bone-setters was Sarah Mapp. Known as Crazy Sally, she learned her skill from her bone-setter father. She was renowned for her strength and her ability to reset almost any bone. Though she lacked the medical education of physicians, she successfully treated dislocated shoulders and knees, among other treatments, in the town of Epsom and at the Grecian Coffee House in London. Before we get into the details surrounding the colorful character that is Sarah Mapp, an ad must play. If you find these ads annoying, you can get ad-free episodes by becoming an MCP patron on Patreon at the lowest tier, just $2 a month. It seems like a small amount, but every little bit of support helps keep this podcast going. To sign up, go to bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron. You'll have my eternal gratitude. Sarah was born in Hindon, Wiltshire, possibly in 1706. There isn't a lot of information about her upbringing, but it is known that her father, John Wallen, was a bonesetter. Some sources say that Sarah's sister was Lavinia Fenton, an actress who ran away with and married the 3rd Duke of Bolton, but that's another story. John Wallen was said to have included Sarah in his bone-setting work from a young age, having her call attention to his booth at fairs and meetings around Wiltshire. When he was unavailable, Sarah did the work for him. She was reportedly quite muscular and strong, and soon gained a reputation as being a better bone-setter than her father. She soon left and established her own practice, supposedly after a family quarrel. She worked under the banner of Cracked Sally, the one and only bonesetter. She traveled from place to place attending local fairs where she practiced her healing skills. She called herself Crazy or Cracked Sally, but was also known as Cross-Eyed Sally. These nicknames were apparently a good description of her, one that she embraced. She had a reputation for being eccentric and quarrelsome, with a tendency to swear almost constantly when she spoke. She was also reportedly slovenly, meaning untidy and often unwashed. She was said to be very ugly due to her bulky, muscular frame and possibly her crossed eyes. She was also said to often be drunk and was regularly seen reeling from side to side, wielding a bottle of gin and screaming obscenities at full volume. Despite her eccentricities, Sarah was very good at what she did. While personally unkempt, she was very neat in her work and took great care in rolling her bandages and organizing them. She was said to have only a basic understanding of human anatomy, but a knack for knowing what bones needed setting and how to set them. Her prodigious strength gave her the power to pull and maneuver new and old dislocated joints into place with ease. Around 1735, her travels took her to Epsom, a town just southwest of London, which at the time was a rising star in the world of horse racing. There, Sarah quickly developed a reputation for effectively resetting joints, some of which had been dislocated for some time. Crazy Sally developed a very strong, almost fervent following in Epsom, especially among the racing crowd, who often needed her to help with sprains, dislocations, and breaks caused by falls from horses. She collected fees from her patients and made quite a comfortable living. By 1736, the community feared she might move on from Epsom and offered her 100 guineas to stay another year and provide her bone-setting services. I wondered how much that was, so I searched through several coinage and inflation websites. I'm no expert, but from what I read, a guinea was a coin that contained an ounce of gold. It was worth about 10 days' wages for a skilled tradesman in 1736. Today, due to its gold content, 1 guinea is worth about £440 or $570, which means that the town of Epsom offered Sarah £44,000 or $57,000 to stay. An article in the London Magazine estimated that Sarah made about 20 guineas a day, the equivalent of £8,800 or $11,400, meaning she'd be a billionaire if she worked every day for a year. It's not known how often she worked, but it's safe to say that she was becoming a very rich woman. In a time before painkillers, her quickness and strength were highly valued. That kind of money, unfortunately, attracts trouble. In 1736, Sarah met Hill Mapp, a footman for a rich cloth merchant. They decided to marry, despite protests from many of Sarah's friends. The story of their wedding is quite a tale, and even though most of it is likely exaggerated, I'd like to share it anyway. Even on the morning of her wedding day, the 4th of August, 1736, Sarah saw patients. One was a child who was diagnosed with a dislocated neck, which was being supported by steel instruments or a medical collar of some type. Sarah quickly set the girl's neck and announced that she would treat no one else until she was a married woman, despite a line of patients waiting for her. She and Hill started on foot towards Ewell, where they hoped to find transportation to London. On their way, they were approached by a man seeking treatment for his 12-year-old daughter, whose spine curved this way and that, probably due to scoliosis. According to the London Magazine, Sarah, quote, set her straight, made the back perfect, and raised the girl 2 inches, end quote. While treating this patient, 2 men approached in a coach sent by a Sir James Edwards and tried to persuade Sarah to return to Epsom and treat the other patients. They were only able to convince her to marry in nearby Headley instead of London. But on the way, Sarah discovered that the minister in Headley had been suspended. The coachman then refused to take her anywhere else except back to Epsom. Furious, Sarah got out of the coach with Hill and walked to a cottage near Headley. When they heard she was there, several local women went to try and persuade Sarah not to marry Hill. Sarah told them she'd abandon Epsom completely if they continued trying to stop her marriage. She and Hill started to walk towards Bonesetter Church, but Sir James Edwards, hearing that his coachman had offended her, sent another coach with a different driver to take Sarah wherever she wanted. While they traveled, several people from Epsom followed behind the coach, pleading with Sarah not to marry Hill. When they arrived at Bonesetter Church, the minister refused to marry them without a license. They decided to go to London as originally planned. Thinking of the patients that weren't being seen because of this debacle of a wedding day, someone took the bride and groom in their carriage to London, saw them married, and then immediately took them back to Epsom. Mrs. Sarah Mapp then continued to see several more patients. Unfortunately, Sarah's friends were a better judge of character than she was. The marriage only lasted a week. Hill Mapp ran away with 100 guineas of Sarah's money and anything else he could carry. It was said that after the initial shock wore off, Sarah wasn't too upset, saying it was money well spent if it got rid of her husband. Sarah Mapp took on patients in London and traveled there once or twice a week in her own coach and 6 horses. She decorated the coach with the crutches of her cured patients, taking them as trophies and proof of her skill. She practiced her bone-setting skills at the Grecian Coffee House, a coffee house at Wapping Old Stairs that was frequented by members of the Royal Society, including Sir Isaac Newton. It was at this location that she healed the niece of Sir Hans Sloane and rocketed into the medical spotlight. Sir Hans Sloane was a baronet, physician, and fellow of the Royal Society, having served 3 successive kings and queens. He was also a collector of many things, and upon his death, he bequeathed his collection to the British nation, providing the foundation for the British Museum, the British Library, and the Natural History Museum of London. However, Sir Isaac Newton described him as, quote, a villain and rascal, end quote, and, quote, a very tricking fellow, end quote. Make of that what you will. Sir Hans Sloane's niece, Miss Sloane, reportedly had a long-standing broken spine, or perhaps shoulder, that stuck out in one spot. Sarah saw her in October of 1736, and with her strong hands, quickly and expertly set the girl's back straight. Sir Sloane told anyone who would listen about Sarah's skill. Her achievements and methods were all over the halfpenny press, and Mrs. Mapp, the bonesetter, now also known as the Shape Mistress, became quite famous. There was even a Crazy Sally impersonator caught in Whitechapel. Various songs and ditties were written about Sally Mapp, sometimes making fun of her, but usually singing her praises. Some of these got under the skin of other unaccredited healers. John Taylor was an eye surgeon and medical charlatan whose treatments included bloodletting, laxatives, and pigeon's blood eye drops. Joshua Ward was another charlatan who invented and widely prescribed what he called Ward's Drops, a pill that he said could cure any illness. In reality, the pills were full of antimony, a type of metal that causes liver damage and poisoning. Taylor and Ward tried to sue Sarah Mapp due to a couplet that was sung about her that defamed them. I'll recite it for you now. Forgot in the bustle are Taylor and Ward, for Mapp's all the cry and her fame's on record. Sarah's response to their suit was to encourage the shouting of another couplet. Quacks without art either blind or kill, but demonstrations prove that mine be all skill. She was also the subject of a song in a comedy play called The Husband's Relief, or The Female Bonesetter and the Worm Doctor, which was performed at the Playhouse in Lincoln's Inn Fields. The song compared her favorably to the highly paid surgeons of London. Sarah even attended the play and thought it was hilarious. In November of 1736, she moved to lodgings in Pall Mall in Westminster, an area known for high-class homes and shops. Unfortunately, this was the last straw for the accredited medical establishment. Professional physicians and surgeons started a campaign against the large number of quack healers operating in London, including Sarah. William Hogarth, the famous political cartoonist, produced a satirical drawing called The Company of Undertakers, in which Sarah was depicted along with quack doctors Taylor and Ward. She's represented as a cross-eyed hag, dressed as a harlequin and looking perplexedly at a human upper arm bone, or humerus. Unfortunately, this is the only physical representation of Sarah Mapp that we have. Sir Percival Pott, a renowned surgeon who eventually became the founder of orthopedics, publicly criticized Sarah Mapp, calling her, quote, an immoral, drunken female savage, end quote. Professional physicians even tried to fool her and prove she was a quack. The London Magazine reported that a man came to her with his hand bandaged up, complaining of a broken or sprained wrist. Unbeknownst to Sarah, he had been sent by some surgeons to test her. Upon examining the wrist, Sarah found nothing wrong with it. Suspecting foul play and as punishment for wasting her time, she gave his wrist a wrench, which dislocated it for real. She told him to go back to the fools who'd sent him and get it set. If he couldn't get it set within a month, she'd put it right herself. Her move to Pall Mall and her growing success unfortunately aggravated Sarah's struggles with alcoholism. She began losing patients due to drunkenness and aggressive behavior. Her descent was sadly as quick as her rise to fame. She soon lost her place in Pall Mall. The Grub Street Journal, which periodically reported on her exploits, documented her death in a short article on December 22, 1737, only about a year after she left Pall Mall. It said that she had been swallowed up by the Seven Dials, one of the most notorious slums in London. She died in her lodgings there, so poor that the parish had to bury her. In the early 1800s, professional interest in bone and joint surgery gave rise to the medical field of orthopedics. As surgeons began to make rational observations about bone disease through work in the dissecting room and on the autopsy table, bonesetters came to be seen as more harmful than helpful to patients. Bonesetters gradually disappeared from England altogether and were replaced by trained physicians. This was overall much better for the patients. This doesn't mean that the techniques of the bonesetters went away completely, however. In 1895, an American folk healer began offering spinal manipulation among his repertoire of cures. He claimed he'd received the skill from the other world, but his techniques took much from 18th century bonesetters. His methods later evolved into chiropractic. Controlled clinical studies of chiropractic treatments have found no evidence that chiropractic manipulation is effective, nor is there enough data to determine how safe it is. There are often mild to moderate side effects, with serious or fatal complications in rare cases. However, millions of people swear by it, so, like bone setting, it hasn't gone away. 18th century bone setting techniques are also found in osteopathic medicine. Osteopathic medicine is a pseudoscientific medical system that emphasizes physical manipulation of muscle tissue and bones. Their techniques are based on the theory of a tissue layer that links every part of the body. Osteopaths attempt to treat their patients' issues, called somatic dysfunction, by manipulating the bones and muscles. Alternative medicines, like bone setting and its modern counterparts chiropractic and osteopathy, originate with patients who are unable to afford proper medical treatment for their issues. Desperate, they turn to practitioners who don't have any medical understanding, but promise miracle cures. which then lead to greater injury as well as distract from scientifically proven treatments. Sarah Mapp seemed like she knew what she was doing, but as with many bonesetters, her successes were widely publicized, while her failures were hardly mentioned at all. Sarah Mapp was such an interesting character, a strong female healer who took everything in stride, didn't care what anyone thought of her or her choices, and made it into London's medical inner circle through effectiveness and brute force. Unfortunately, her meteoric career came back down to earth, but not before she shook up the medical community, forcing them to look more thoroughly at bone and joint medicine. That is why Sarah Mapp, Cracked Sally, sparks our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.